There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew shatters like glass striking stone, and in that breaking, something truer emerges from the fragments. This is a story about such a moment, about a woman named Zara, whose grace became legend, and about the night when cruelty met its match in the form of quiet dignity. Picture, if you will, a grand ballroom where crystal chandeliers hang like frozen stars, where marble floors gleam with the reflection of 300 souls dressed in their finest, where champagne flows like rivers of gold, and where beneath all that beauty, something ancient and terrible is about to unfold. Zara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her wedding dress catching light. Like captured moonbeams, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and unnamed dread. She had married the man she loved just hours before, had spoken vows that bound their souls in ways that transcended the material world, had looked into Kwame's eyes and seen her future reflected there like the surface of a still lake. But behind her, in the shadows where happiness could not reach, his mother stood like a monument to everything cold and unforgiving in this world. Victoria Asante, a woman whose name commanded respect across continents, whose wealth could buy kingdoms, whose pride ran deeper than any ocean, had watched her son marry a village girl with barely concealed disgust. The celebration below continued in ignorance of the storm brewing above, guests laughing and dancing and drinking to a union half of them secretly doubted would last. And in that moment, suspended between joy and catastrophe, Zara felt her grandmother's words echo through her mind like a prayer, like a warning, like a promise she had made to herself long ago. Victoria's voice cut through the air like a blade wrapped in velvet, cold and precise, and designed to wound in places no one else could see. She spoke of disappointment and family shame, of traditions betrayed and legacies threatened, of how a woman from nowhere had somehow bewitched her son into forgetting who he was and where he came from. Zara listened with the patience her grandmother had taught her. That deep well of calm that comes from knowing your worth isn't up for debate. That understanding your dignity is something you carry within yourself rather than something others can grant or revoke. She had heard these words before, in different forms and different contexts, throughout the 6 months since Kwame had first looked at her, with eyes that saw beyond circumstances and status. She had heard them from society women who whispered behind fans, from business associates who questioned Kwame's judgment, from distant relatives who mourned the arranged marriage that would never be, from everyone who had invested in the idea that love should follow logic rather than truth. But hearing them now, on what should have been the happiest night of her life, from the woman who had given birth to the man she loved, felt different somehow, felt heavier, felt like standing at the edge of a precipice and being asked to justify your right to solid ground. Zara turned slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, her grandmother's training evident in every gesture, and she looked at Victoria with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only a deep sadness for a woman who had confused control with love. The older woman's face twisted with something that might have been rage or might have been fear, and in that instant, everything changed. The push itself was almost casual, a gesture born not of thought, but of impulse, of a woman so accustomed to moving obstacles from her path that she didn't consider consequences until they were already in motion. Victoria's hand connected with Zara's shoulder, and physics took over where intention left off, and suddenly the young bride was falling, her body arcing backward into space, her hands grasping at air that offered no purchase, her dress billowing around her, like the wings of a bird shot from the sky. Time performed that strange trick it does in moments of crisis, stretching seconds into eternities, allowing Zara to see everything with crystalline clarity as she tumbled down marble stairs that seemed to multiply beneath her, each impact a thunderclap of pain that registered somewhere distant from her conscious mind. She saw the chandeliers spinning above her, saw the horrified faces of guests beginning to turn toward the sound, saw her own reflection fractured across polished surfaces, saw Kwame's face transforming from joy to horror as understanding reached him too late to prevent what was already happening. The world became a kaleidoscope of light and shadow and pain, of gold fabric and white marble and red blood, of gasps that rose like a wave from 300 throats, of music that continued playing because the musicians hadn't yet understood that celebration had turned to catastrophe. And then she was still, crumpled at the bottom of the staircase, like a discarded doll, her body a constellation of pain, her head bleeding onto pristine marble, her vision blurred but still conscious, still aware, still somehow holding on to the core of who she was, even as everything else seemed to be breaking apart around her. The ballroom had gone silent in that way that only true shock can create. A silence so complete it seemed to have weight and texture, seemed to press down on everyone present, like the hand of judgment itself. 300 people frozen mid-gesture, champagne glasses arrested halfway to lips, conversations dying mid-syllable. Dancers stopped in positions that would have been graceful in motion, but looked absurd in stillness. Victoria began her descent down the stairs, her face already arranging itself into an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes, her mouth opening to shape words that would rewrite what everyone had just witnessed, that would transform assault into accident and cruelty into tragedy. But before she could speak, before she could craft the narrative that would protect her reputation and preserve her power, something else happened, something that would be talked about for years afterward, something that would define not just that night, but everything that came after. Kwame moved, and in that movement was everything that mattered, everything that would ever matter, every truth about love and loyalty and choosing what's right over what's easy. He crossed the ballroom floor with a purpose that made people step back instinctively, his expensive shoes striking marble with the rhythm of a war drum, his face transformed from the gentle man Zara knew into something harder and more dangerous, something that had always existed beneath the polished surface, but had never before needed to emerge. He dropped to his knees beside his wife, without concern for his designer suit, or his public image, or the 300 witnesses watching his every move, and his hands, those hands that signed billion-dollar contracts and shaped corporate empires, cradled her bleeding head with a gentleness that made several people in the crowd begin to cry. Kwame's voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, meant only for Zara, intimate in the midst of chaos, a private moment shared in the most public of spaces. He told her to breathe, told her he was there, told her she wasn't alone and never would be, told her things that only she could hear, promises and reassurances and declarations of love that had nothing to do with the crowd and everything to do with the connection that had brought them to this moment. Zara's vision swam, but she could see him clearly, could see past the blur of tears and pain to the truth of his presence, could feel the steadiness of his hands anchoring her to consciousness, could hear the tremor in his voice that revealed how terrified he was beneath the calm exterior he presented to the world. Someone called for an ambulance, and someone else was crying, and someone somewhere was praying aloud, in a language Zara didn't recognize, but understood, on a level deeper than words. Victoria reached the bottom of the stairs and extended a hand toward her son's shoulder, her mouth opening to speak, to explain, to justify, to do whatever necessary to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her ability to manage. But Kwame turned his head toward her, with a look that stopped her mid-gesture, a look that contained no forgiveness, no understanding, no room for excuses or explanations, a look that said more than words ever could about where his loyalties truly lay. The whispered lie died on Victoria's lips as she saw something in her son's eyes that she had never seen before, something that looked like the death of whatever relationship they had once shared, something that told her she had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. In the hospital's harsh fluorescent lighting, far from the chandeliers and champagne and pretense of the ballroom, truth had a way of asserting itself with uncomfortable clarity. Zara lay in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and fear, her body mapped with bruises that would bloom purple and yellow over the coming days, her head bandaged where it had struck marble, her ribs wrapped where they had taken the worst of the impact. The doctors spoke in calm, professional tones about concussions and contusions and the remarkable luck that had prevented anything from breaking permanently, about how she would heal in time, about how the human body possessed extraordinary resilience when given proper care and rest. But they said nothing about the other wounds, the invisible ones, the ones that no X-ray could detect and no medicine could treat, the ones that came from being pushed by the woman who was supposed to welcome you into the family, from being hurt in front of everyone you hoped to build a life among, from having your worst fears about belonging confirmed in the most public and painful way possible. Kwame had refused to leave her side, had ignored the hospital's policies about visiting hours and family-only restrictions, had made it clear through the sheer force of his presence and his resources that he would be there, or there would be consequences. He sat in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, still wearing his blood-stained wedding suit, his hand wrapped around hers like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth, his eyes never leaving her face, even when she finally fell into exhausted sleep. Outside the room, his phone buzzed constantly, with messages from board members and lawyers and relatives and reporters, a whole world demanding his attention and his explanation and his decisions. But he silenced each notification without reading them, choosing presence over performance for perhaps the first time in his adult life. When Zara finally woke, the sky beyond the window had shifted from black to gray. That ambiguous hour before dawn, when night hasn't quite surrendered to day. She blinked slowly, her mind working to process where she was and why everything hurt. Memories of the fall, returning in fragments like a puzzle reassembling itself, piece by painful piece. Kwame leaned forward instantly, his tired face flooding with relief, his hand tightening around hers, as if to confirm she was truly conscious, truly still with him. They looked at each other in silence for a long moment, a conversation happening beneath words, an understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the bond they had forged in fire. Finally, Zara spoke, her voice rough from disuse and medication, asking the question that mattered more than any other. Could they really do this? Could they really build a life together, when his family would always see her as an intruder? When every gathering would be a battlefield? When love had to fight for its right to exist? Kwame's answer was immediate and certain, delivered with the quiet conviction of someone who had spent the night contemplating exactly this question, who had stared into the darkness and emerged with clarity about what mattered most. He told her about the calls he had made from the ambulance, about the lawyers he had instructed to prepare papers, about the ultimatum he had delivered to his mother, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. He told her that she was his family now, that everything else was just history and obligation, that he chose her not in spite of the complications, but because of who she was when everything else was stripped away. But understanding all of this requires going back, requires knowing how a village girl and a billionaire's son found each other in the first place, requires understanding that the most powerful love stories don't begin with grand gestures, but with small moments of recognition, with the shock of seeing yourself reflected in someone else's eyes. Zara had grown up in a place where red earth met endless sky, where community meant more than wealth, where respect was earned through character rather than purchased with money, where every evening brought neighbors together to share food and stories and laughter under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in an accident she was too young to remember, had taught her everything worth knowing about dignity and grace and the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. The old woman had been a healer and a wise woman, someone the village came to for remedies and advice, and the kind of wisdom that comes from living long enough to see patterns repeat themselves across generations. She had taught Zara to read by candlelight, had encouraged her dreams of becoming a teacher, had never once suggested that wanting more than village life offered was a betrayal of where she came from. But she had also taught her granddaughter that external circumstances meant nothing if you lost your internal compass, that you could live in a mansion and still be poor in spirit, that true wealth was measured in love and purpose and the peace that comes from living authentically. When the old woman died, Zara had buried her beneath the mango tree they used to sit under, had inherited a small house and a box of letters that revealed her grandmother had once faced her own crossroads between status and love. Necessity had brought Zara to the city, the need to earn money to survive after her grandmother's death, the need to find work in a place where opportunities existed beyond subsistence farming and market stalls. She had taken a job at the Grand Meridian Hotel, a place so luxurious it seemed like something from another planet, where guest rooms cost more per night than her village saw in months, where the staff uniform she wore was finer than anything she had owned before. She had cleaned rooms with quiet efficiency, had learned to be invisible in the way service workers must be, present enough to fulfill needs, but invisible enough not to disturb the wealthy guests who barely registered her existence. For 6 months, she had moved through that gleaming world like a ghost, saving every coin, sending money back to relatives in the village, dreaming of eventually having enough to go to teacher's college and build the life her grandmother had envisioned for her. And then, Kwame Asante had checked into the penthouse floor for an extended business stay, and something shifted in ways neither of them could have predicted or prevented. She had been assigned to his floor, had entered his suite that first morning, expecting just another wealthy guest, just another person who would look through her rather than at her. But he had turned from the window where he stood, gazing at the city, and he had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that made her understand her grandmother's warnings about being careful what you wish for, because the universe might actually be listening. Their first real conversation had happened in a stairwell of all places, on the anniversary of her grandmother's death, when grief had ambushed Zara during her shift, and she had hidden away to cry where no one would witness her breaking. Kwame had found her there by accident, had taken a wrong turn after a frustrating business call, and stumbled into that concrete space where the hotel's beautiful facade gave way to utilitarian function. He had seen her tears and done something unexpected, had sat down on those cold stairs and asked her to tell him about what hurt, had listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like every word mattered. She had told him about her grandmother, about the village, about loss and loneliness and the strange isolation of being surrounded by people in a city where no one really knew her. And Kwame, this man whose name opened doors and whose wealth could buy almost anything, had responded not with pity or dismissal, but with recognition. had shared his own story of loss and the weight of inheriting his father's empire before he had finished grieving for the man himself. They had talked for an hour in that stairwell, two people from completely different worlds, discovering they spoke the same language of loneliness and longing, and the desire to be seen as human beings rather than as functions or symbols. From that day forward, something shifted between them, a connection that neither fully understood, but both felt powerfully, a gravitational pull that made Kwame rearrange meetings so he would be in his suite when Zara came to clean, that made Zara take extra care with her appearance, even though she told herself it was just professional pride. Their relationship grew in stolen moments and quiet conversations, in the early morning hours before the city fully woke, and in the late evening lulls between business dinners and social obligations. Kwame found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, thoughts about the pressure of carrying his family's legacy, doubts about whether the life he was living was the life he actually wanted, dreams about finding meaning beyond profit margins and market shares. Zara listened with the same quality of attention she had learned from her grandmother, that way of being present that makes people feel safe enough to speak their deepest truths. She shared her own dreams about teaching, about building bridges between her village and the wider world, about finding a way to honor where she came from while still reaching toward something more. They debated philosophy and poetry, discussed what makes a life well lived, argued playfully about whether change happens through revolution or evolution, found themselves laughing at jokes no one else would understand because they emerged from the unique space they were creating together. The hotel staff noticed and began to whisper, speculating about intentions and outcomes, making assumptions based on ancient patterns of wealthy men and service workers. But what Kwame and Zara were building had nothing to do with those old stories, existed in a space beyond the categories people tried to force them into, was something neither had been looking for, but both recognized as rare and precious when they found it. The complications began when Victoria Asante arrived unannounced, her presence like a cold front moving through the hotel, her purpose clear in every calculated gesture and cutting remark. She had come to check on her son's progress, to ensure he hadn't forgotten the arranged marriage she had been engineering with an ambassador's daughter, to remind him of obligations and expectations and the weight of family legacy. She had brought Kioma with her, a woman who was beautiful and accomplished and perfect on paper, who came from the right family and had the right education and understood the unspoken rules of their social stratosphere. Victoria had orchestrated dinners and introduced Kioma to Kwame's business associates and made it abundantly clear what future she envisioned and expected. And then she had noticed how her son looked at the housekeeping girl, had seen something in his eyes when Zara entered a room that she had never seen when Kioma was present, had recognized with a mother's instinct that something was happening that threatened everything she had planned. The confrontation had been inevitable, had come one afternoon when Victoria cornered Zara in a hallway and spoke with the kind of cold cruelty that people mistake for honesty, telling this village girl that she was delusional if she thought a man like Kwame would actually choose her, that whatever was happening was a phase or rebellion or a rich man's entertainment that would end the moment reality reasserted itself. Zara had listened with dignity, had refused to defend herself or argue, had simply said that she couldn't speak for Kwame's intentions, but she knew her own worth wasn't dependent on his validation or anyone else's approval. But Victoria's warning had planted seeds of doubt that grew in the darkness of Zara's mind during sleepless nights when she lay alone in her small room and wondered if she was being foolish, if she was mistaking kindness for something deeper, if she was setting herself up for heartbreak by believing that love could transcend the vast differences in their circumstances. She began pulling back, keeping conversations professional, trying to rebuild the walls that had crumbled during those months of connection. Kwame noticed immediately, felt the distance she was creating, and understood why, even as it frustrated him, knew that his mother's poison was working exactly as intended. He had confronted Victoria directly, had told her in terms that allowed no ambiguity that his life was his own to live, that her approval was something he hoped for but didn't require, that Zara was not a phase or a rebellion, but someone he was choosing consciously and deliberately. The fight that followed had been epic, mother and son facing each other across battle lines, drawn by love and duty and competing visions of what loyalty really meant. Victoria had threatened and pleaded, and used every tool in her arsenal, had talked about family reputation and business relationships, and the disappointment of his late father, had painted a picture of disaster and disgrace and consequences that would ripple across generations. But Kwame had stood firm, had discovered something about himself in that confrontation, had realized that living a life designed to meet others' expectations was just another form of death, slow and respectable, but death nonetheless. He had gone to Zara afterward, had found her in the hotel's garden where she sometimes went during breaks, and had asked her to give him a chance to prove that what they felt was real and worth fighting for. The 6 months that followed were a delicate dance between hope and fear, between building something beautiful and watching others try to dismantle it, between the private truth of their connection and the public pressure that bore down on them from every direction. Kwame began integrating Zara into his life in small but significant ways, introducing her to friends who judged by character rather than pedigree, taking her to places where her intelligence and grace could shine, showing her that his world wasn't monolithic, that there were spaces within it where she could belong without losing herself. Zara discovered that she could navigate these spaces with the same dignity she brought to everything else, that the lessons her grandmother had taught about respect and self-worth translated across contexts, that being authentic was actually an advantage rather than a liability in rooms full of people performing versions of themselves they thought others wanted to see. They took weekend trips to her village, where Kwame experienced a kind of community and acceptance he hadn't known existed, where people valued him for how he treated others rather than what his bank account contained, where he could sit under the stars and remember what simplicity felt like. He saw Zara in her element, teaching children to read, helping elderly neighbors with chores, moving through her community with the kind of belonging that comes from being known and loved for exactly who you are. And he understood then what he was asking her to sacrifice by joining his world, understood that she wasn't moving up, but sideways into a space that was just different, not better, understood that her yes to him would cost her things that money couldn't replace. The proposal happened beneath the mango tree where Zara's grandmother was buried. Kwame kneeling in red earth, in his expensive suit, asking this woman who had changed everything to choose him, despite all the complications their love entailed. He promised her partnerships rather than rescue, promised to build something together rather than absorb her into his existing life, promised to honor her roots even as they reached toward a shared future. The ring was simple, a single diamond that caught light, like hope crystallized, and when Zara said yes, through tears that mixed joy and fear in equal measure, the entire village erupted in celebration, because love this genuine was rare enough to be recognized and honored. But Victoria's absence from any of the celebrations spoke volumes, her refusal to acknowledge the engagement, a form of protest that poisoned what should have been purely joyful. She made it clear that while she couldn't prevent the marriage, She would never accept it, would never welcome Zara into the family, would make every gathering and holiday a subtle battle for territory and dignity. Friends urged Kwame to wait, to give his mother time to adjust, to consider whether starting a marriage under these conditions was wise. But he had waited long enough, had spent too many years living according to others' timelines and priorities, had finally found something real enough to fight for. So they planned two weddings, one in Zara's village that honored her traditions and her people, one in the city that satisfied social obligations and public expectations. The village ceremony was everything a wedding should be, full of joy and dancing, and elders blessing their union with prayers that reached back through generations. The city wedding was something else entirely, a performance for an audience that couldn't decide whether to applaud or object. The days leading up to the city ceremony were fraught with small cruelties disguised as concern, with Victoria inserting herself into every decision and undermining Zara's choices at every turn. She changed the menu without consultation, rearranged seating to isolate Zara's family, questioned every aspect of the bride's taste and preparation, with comments designed to sound helpful while actually emphasizing inadequacy. Zara endured it all with remarkable grace, picking her battles carefully, refusing to give Victoria the dramatic confrontation she seemed to be provoking. She had her grandmother's voice in her head, reminding her that dignity wasn't about winning every argument, but about maintaining your center, even when others tried to knock you off balance. About understanding that people's cruelty revealed their pain rather than your worth. About staying true to yourself, even when staying true required bending rather than breaking. The wedding day arrived heavy, with expectation and tension. The historic mansion, where it was held, decorated with flowers and candles and all the symbols of celebration that felt hollow when the key participants approached the day as a battleground rather than a beginning. Zara dressed in her chosen gown, simple and elegant, in ways that made expensive look cheap, her natural beauty enhanced rather than hidden, her nervousness visible only to those who knew her well enough to read the small tells. Her village family clustered together in their corner, where Victoria had relegated them, dressed in their finest, but clearly uncomfortable in this world of marble and crystal and cold politeness. Kwame's side filled the rest of the space, wealthy and powerful, and watching everything with the calculating eyes of people who saw life as a series of strategic moves rather than moments to be experienced and treasured. The ceremony itself was beautiful, despite everything. The vows they spoke, carrying genuine emotion that even the most cynical observers couldn't entirely dismiss. The moment when they were pronounced married, feeling like a small victory, won against considerable odds. Zara walked back down the aisle, as Mrs. Asante feeling both triumph and trepidation, aware that getting through the ceremony was just the beginning, that the reception would be where the real tests came. She was right to be concerned, though she couldn't have predicted exactly how the evening would unfold, couldn't have imagined that her mother-in-law's hatred would manifest in physical violence rather than just verbal cruelty. The reception began well enough, with music and dancing, and toasts that managed to sound sincere, even when delivered by people who had bet against this marriage, lasting a year. Zara moved through the crowd, with grace that came from her grandmother's training and her own innate dignity, thanking guests who barely concealed their condescension, making conversation with people who looked through her, even as they spoke to her, winning over a few hearts simply by being genuinely interested in others rather than performing interest for strategic purposes. She could feel Victoria watching her constantly, could sense the older woman's fury building like a storm gathering strength, could almost predict that something would break before the evening ended. But she pushed the feeling aside, focused on the joy of being married to someone who saw her truly, on the presence of her village family who had traveled to be with her, on the knowledge that whatever happened next, she and Kwame had made their choice and spoken their truth publicly. The moment came when Zara excused herself to go upstairs and prepare for the first dance, following tradition that required the bride to change into a different dress, to make an entrance down the grand staircase that would mark the transition from ceremony to celebration. She stood at the top of those marble stairs, looking down at the ballroom full of people, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions, thinking about how far she had come, from that village where red earth stained your feet and everyone knew your name and your story. She thought about her grandmother, who had given up her own comfortable life to marry for love, who had chosen authenticity over approval, who had lived in that village not as a martyr, but as a woman who understood what mattered most. She thought about Kwame waiting below, about the life they would build together, about the challenges they would face and overcome, about the possibility that love really could be enough if two people were brave enough to choose it daily. And then Victoria appeared behind her, and in that moment, Zara understood that some people would rather destroy what they cannot control than allow it to exist beyond their influence, would rather see their own children hurt than admit they might have been wrong about something fundamental. The words Victoria spoke were designed to wound, accusations about unworthiness and manipulation, predictions of failure and abandonment, the concentrated venom of months of resentment, distilled into sentences that struck like fists even before the physical push came. Zara had been turning to respond, with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout, had been preparing to once again refuse engagement with cruelty, had been choosing the high road, even as Victoria dragged the conversation lower. And then she was falling, the world tilting and spinning as her body lost contact with solid ground, as gravity asserted its claim, and physics transformed intention into consequence. The fall itself lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but contained lifetimes, contained every fear about not belonging, every doubt about whether love could survive in hostile territory, every question about what happens when you reach for something beyond what your circumstances promised. She hit the stairs hard, her body taking impacts that would leave marks for weeks, her head striking marble with a sound that made people gasp, her wedding dress tangling around her legs as she tumbled down like a broken bird shot from the sky. And when she finally stopped at the bottom, when the falling ended, and she lay crumpled and bleeding on pristine marble, there was a moment of perfect silence when everyone simply stared, when the reality of what they had witnessed was still processing, when the evening hung suspended between what had been and what would come next. Zara's vision blurred with pain and tears and the particular disorientation that comes from head trauma. But through it all, she could see shapes moving toward her, could hear voices rising in concern and confusion, could feel the cold marble beneath her and the warmth of blood trickling from her temple. She tried to move and discovered that pain had opinions about that, tried to speak and found her voice had temporarily abandoned her, tried to make sense of what had just happened and found her mind couldn't quite hold on to the sequence of events. And then Kwame was there, his face appearing above hers, like the sun breaking through clouds, his hands cradling her head with impossible gentleness, his voice cutting through the chaos with words meant only for her. What happened next would be discussed and debated for years afterward, would become the moment that defined not just that evening, but everything that came after, would mark a turning point in how certain circles understood power and loyalty and what it meant to truly stand by someone you claimed to love. Kwame had been across the ballroom, When he heard the commotion, had turned toward the sound, with that sixth sense that tells you something terrible has happened before your mind fully processes what your eyes are seeing. He had seen Zara's body tumbling down the stairs, and the world had narrowed to just that sight. Everything else falling away as unimportant. Every business deal and social obligation and family expectation revealed as trivial compared to the woman he loved, lying broken at the bottom of marble stairs. He had moved faster than he knew he could move, had crossed that floor with single-minded purpose, had dropped to his knees in his wedding suit, without thought for how it looked or what it cost, had gathered his wife into his arms like she was made of light and air and everything precious. The crowd had watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing something that would be remembered and retold, something that split time into before and after, something that revealed truth in ways that normal circumstances couldn't. And when Victoria had tried to shape the narrative, had begun her descent down the stairs with practiced concern and carefully chosen words designed to minimize what everyone had actually seen, when she had reached out to touch her son's shoulder in a gesture meant to reclaim connection and control, Kwame had looked at her with eyes that held no forgiveness, no understanding, no room for the relationship they had once shared. In the ambulance racing toward the hospital, while paramedics worked and sirens screamed, and the city passed by in streaks of light, Kwame held Zara's hand and made promises about what came next, about how things would be different, about how he would never again allow anyone to hurt her, regardless of who that anyone was or what familial claims they made. Zara drifted in and out of consciousness, pain medication making everything soft and distant, but she heard him and understood the weight of what he was saying, understood that this moment was transforming him in ways that couldn't be undone, that the man holding her hand was different from the man who had stood at the altar hours earlier. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what felt like a miracle, given the height and hardness of those marble stairs, confirmed that while she was bruised and concussed and hurting, nothing was broken beyond repair, nothing was damaged in ways that time and care couldn't heal. But they couldn't see the other wounds, the ones that cut deeper than flesh and bone. The injury to her sense of safety in a world that had shown its capacity for sudden violence. The damage to her hope that acceptance might eventually come from Kwame's family. She lay in that hospital bed, watching dawn break through the window, and wondered if love was enough when the price of love kept rising, when every step forward seemed to cost something essential, when being together meant constant warfare with people who should have been allies. Kwame saw the doubt in her eyes and understood its source, understood that his mother's cruelty had achieved its goal of making Zara question whether she belonged, whether the struggle was worth it, whether love could survive in such hostile territory. But doubt only has power if you give it room to grow, if you let it take root in soil, fertilized by fear and watered by other people's voices telling you what you should want and who you should be. Kwame spent those hospital hours making calls that would reshape his family's power structure, activating lawyers and accountants and board members, setting in motion consequences that matched the severity of what Victoria had done. He called his mother from Zara's hospital room and delivered an ultimatum in tones that left no space for negotiation, told her she would publicly apologize or face prosecution for assault, told her she would resign from positions of authority or find herself completely cut off, told her she would seek help for whatever darkness lived inside her or lose her son entirely. It wasn't about revenge, but about boundaries, about making clear that actions had consequences even when committed by people accustomed to immunity, about protecting his wife from future harm by ensuring everyone understood exactly where his loyalties lay. Victoria initially resisted, tried to use every tool in her considerable arsenal, appealed to family loyalty and business concerns and the weight of tradition, suggested that Kwame was overreacting, that accidents happen, that surely he wouldn't destroy family bonds over a mere stumble. But 300 witnesses had seen what actually happened. Social media had captured moments before and after, and the narrative Victoria wanted to craft couldn't survive contact with documented truth. She was forced to choose between accountability and total severance, between admitting fault and losing her son completely, between the pride that had driven her to push a woman downstairs and the love that still existed beneath all her cruelty and control. The weeks and months that followed were a study in transformation, in how crisis can either destroy what's fragile or forge what's strong into something unbreakable, in how families can evolve or dissolve, depending on whether pride or love ultimately wins the internal battle each person fights. Victoria chose accountability, though it clearly cost her everything her identity had been built upon, delivered a public apology that was covered by media outlets, fascinated by this very public fall from grace, stepped down from boards and committees that had defined her social standing, and began the hard work of examining why she had been so threatened by her son's happiness that she had resorted to violence. She met with Zara privately weeks after the incident, sat across from her daughter-in-law in a neutral space, and spoke words that were clearly difficult, but also genuine, acknowledged the harm she had caused, and the twisted thinking that had justified it, asked not for forgiveness, but for a chance to do better going forward. Zara listened with the grace her grandmother had modeled, neither rushing to absolve, nor refusing to acknowledge the courage it took for Victoria to sit in that space of accountability, understanding that healing happens in layers rather than all at once, that transformation is a process rather than an event. She told Victoria that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, that their relationship would never look like the traditional mother-daughter bond Victoria might have envisioned, but that she was willing to leave room for something authentic, to grow, if Victoria was willing to do the work required. It wasn't a movie moment of tears and embraces, wasn't a neat resolution that tied everything up perfectly, but it was honest, and honesty had become the currency Zara valued above all else. Kwame watched his wife extend this grace to his mother, and fell in love with her all over again, seeing in that moment the strength that doesn't need to prove itself through hardness, the power that comes from choosing dignity over revenge, the wisdom that understands people are complex and capable of change even when they've caused tremendous harm. The broader family and social circle watched these developments with fascination and judgment in equal measure, some applauding the accountability and growth, others whispering that Zara was a fool to give Victoria any opening at all, most simply uncertain how to process a situation that defied their usual categories of victim and villain, right and wrong, forgiveness and justice. As Zara healed physically, as the bruises faded from purple to yellow to the ghost of remembered pain, as her concussion symptoms gradually released their grip and her body remembered how to move without hurt, something else was healing too, something deeper and more fundamental than broken skin and traumatized tissue. She was discovering that the fall had not diminished her, but had somehow clarified what she already knew about herself, had burned away any remaining uncertainty about her worth and her right to occupy whatever space she chose to inhabit. She returned to work, not at the hotel, but in a new role Kwame had helped her create, directing a foundation that connected rural communities with urban opportunities, that brought village craftspeople and city markets together, that built bridges rather than reinforcing the walls, that kept different worlds separate. She moved through her days with purpose that had nothing to do with proving herself to anyone, and everything to do with living, aligned with her deepest values, with honoring her grandmother's legacy by helping others find their own paths between tradition and possibility. Her relationship with Kwame deepened in ways that crisis either enables or prevents, their love tested by fire and emerging not undamaged, but stronger for having survived what would have destroyed something less authentic. They learned how to be married, not in the fairy tale sense, but in the real sense, how to navigate disagreements and differences, how to support each other's individual growth while building something shared, how to create a partnership that honored both their histories while writing a future that belonged uniquely to them. Victoria kept her promises, did the therapeutic work required to understand her own wounds and how they had shaped her cruelty, slowly rebuilt relationship with her son on terms that acknowledged the harm she had caused and the changes she was making. It wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was movement toward light rather than continued dwelling in darkness, and that movement mattered more than the destination. Years passed in the way years do, carrying away some things and delivering others, transforming sharp memories into softer stories, turning that terrible night into a moment that people referenced when they wanted to talk about love and loyalty, and choosing what's right over what's easy. Zara and Kwame built a life that blended their worlds rather than forcing one to subsume the other, splitting their time between the city and the village, raising children who knew both the taste of red earth and the glitter of marble floors, creating something entirely their own rather than fitting into existing templates. They returned to those grand stairs every year on their anniversary, not to relive trauma, but to remember transformation, to mark how far they had traveled from that moment of falling to this moment of standing together, to acknowledge that sometimes you have to break before you can rebuild stronger. The story of that night spread far beyond their immediate circle, became one of those tales that people told to illustrate larger truths that got reshaped and retold until fact and legend blurred together, that carried meaning beyond the specific people and events it described. Some focused on the cruelty and the fall, turning it into a cautionary tale about family dysfunction and the violence that privilege sometimes enables. Others focused on Kwame's choice in that moment, on how he had dropped to his knees without hesitation, on the message that sent about what real love looks like when crisis demands decision. But Zara preferred to focus on what came after, on the long, slow work of healing and building and choosing each other daily, on the way that single terrible moment had become the foundation for everything meaningful that followed. She would tell people who asked for her story that dignity isn't about never falling, but about how you rise. That love isn't about avoiding conflict, but about facing it together. That transformation happens not in dramatic moments, but in the thousands of small choices you make afterward. That the real victory wasn't surviving that night, but building a life worth surviving for. And when her own children asked about the scars she carried, both visible and invisible, from that fall down marble stairs, she told them the truth, without decoration or drama, explained that sometimes people hurt us because they're hurting. That forgiveness is something you do for yourself as much as for others. That grace is a practice rather than a destination. And that love built on truth is the greatest treasure of all, because it's the only kind that survives when everything else falls away.